So, hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this morning or evening, whatever it is your time. My name's Lydia Harrison, MW. I'm head of education and events at WSET School in London, and it's my pleasure to sort of co-host, well, not co-host, just support really this webinar with Winemakers of Rutherglen today to give you all the details and really sort of in-depth technical information about Rutherglen Muscat. And we were joined by Jen Pfeiffer and Stephen Chambers who are in Rutherglen as we speak, and will be taking you through a presentation. So I'm really, really thankful for their time and for them joining us this evening. Just a bit of housekeeping, so you can say hello in the chat, but please do use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen for questions. You can feel free to put those in as we go through, and I will put those to Jen and Stephen if it's something that they are talking about. Otherwise, if it's just something else that you're really interested to know, please pop it in the Q&A and I'll put the questions to them at the end. And we are recording this webinar, so if you want to watch it back, or you might be watching it on review, this will be going up on the WSET School London's YouTube channel shortly afterwards. So thank you for joining, and I will pass over to the experts. So we're joined by Jen Pfeiffer and Stephen Chambers, and thank you.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and g'day to everyone tuning in. It's our great pleasure to be here tonight and to present to you some information about Muscat of Rutherglen, something that we're both so passionate about. I think it's great to have Stephen and I here as co-presenters. We have quite different family histories within the world of Rutherglen. Stephen is fifth or sixth generation winemaker. Sixth generation winemaker. There's so many generations I can't remember. And I'm a second generation winemaker. So in fortified winemaking terms, that means I'm the new kid on the block, and Stephen is fortified royalty. And so because of that, I think, we approach making Muscat of Rutherglen from two different perspectives. Our sites where we're growing our fruit are quite different. Our winemaking styles quite different, and subsequently our wine styles are quite different. And I guess the more you delve into Rutherglen Muscat, the more you appreciate these differences within that broader scope. So tonight we're here at the Pfeiffer Wines cellar door, and behind me we have a couple of casks that are both full. To my right, we've got some Rutherglen Taupe, and to my left we have some 2008 Rutherglen Muscat that's maturing gracefully. So I think the scene's set for a great evening. So yeah, I guess to kick things off, one of the things that's really important to understand when thinking about any fortified wine is the past. Because the past shapes not only the present, but it also shapes the future of these wines. So I think, we just want to touch briefly on the history of Rutherglen.
Oh, that's my turn.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Hello, everybody. So the history of Rutherglen actually goes back to the 1850s as a wine-making district. The reason that the grapes were put in the ground was basically it was found that we had soil suitable enough for grapes, and the rain fell at the right time and adequate quantities. We then go to...
And I think, the settlers who were planting the grapes had European heritage. So there's a lot of German and French settlers in the district, and so they brought with them their culture of wine and their interest in wine, and that's what also cultivated that.
Yeah, so some of the earliest vignerons were surnames Roux, Brown, Graham, Campbell, Gehrig. So you hear there's a big mix there. There's also Campbell. So there's quite a mix of nationalities and views. And it's around about in the 1850s is when the first vines went in. 1860 is actually what led to the establishment of the township of Rutherglen when gold was discovered. So there was already gold in the district, in the area of Beechworth and Chiltern, and they decided to see whether there was any gold in the Rutherglen district, and they went digging, and there's actually a can in town to signify where they found it on the 9th of September 1860. And that all of a sudden brought a great influx of people into the district, which obviously have a thirst, which helped the Vineyards no end. So
Yeah, and from there, Rutherglen really strengthened its wine production. In fact, Rutherglen became the largest producing region of wine, certainly in the state of Victoria, if not Australia, with the production of fortified wines. And this was really driven a lot by exports and bulk exports. So over 150 years ago, we didn't enjoy the luxury and the technology that we get to use today in terms of our winemaking. And so fortification was crucial for the preservation of the wines that was being shipped in bulk, in barrels, in flagons, and the likes. And Rutherglen was a really vibrant, important part of the worldwide landscape of wine. And it was a thriving industry. So much so that when phylloxera hit in the late 1800s, the industry was so strong, and the will and the desire to, I guess, bounce back from that saw, very, very quick adaptation and the replanting of vines onto, American rootstocks to, prevent phylloxera. And I often sort of reflect on the impact of phylloxera. It's, been crippling to so many vineyards and so many places all over the world, but now it almost, in a way, protects the IP that is Rutherglen Muscat, if you like. Due to, I guess, quarantine laws and the like, muscat cuttings, muscat vines, muscat grape matter can't be removed from vineyards here in the area. And so actually our clones that have developed or mutated, I suppose, over time to be very specific to Rutherglen remain in Rutherglen, and that's actually a point of great strength for us today, I think.
Yeah, I suppose when we talk about the grape itself, we are making our wines from Muscat to Petit Grands Rouge. For a long time, it was called Rutherglen Brown Muscat, as it is brown, reddish in colour. And whilst the Vineyards knew they had a Muscat variety, they weren't entirely sure about which one. It wasn't until the 70s that it was actually correctly identified as Muscat of Petit Grands Rouge.
Yeah, and I think that's a great sort of segue into talking a little bit about the viticulture of the district. Or maybe let's just just broadly about Rutherglen today. So we're a relatively small region, so we have around 780 hectares planted under vine. And that mix is a very broad range of varietals. So table wine production is important to the area as well. So we not only have we planted Muscat and Muscadel for Taupe, but there's large plantings of things like Shiraz and Jarif.
But there's also some weird and wonderful varieties too, which harks back to the history of the size of the district and how we were seeing it. We trialled a lot of varieties, and so you have oddities like Gamay sitting in the Pfeiffer vineyard here, and we've got things like Cinsal and Gouet Blanc in ours, and these are varieties which are not really found very much else outside the region. I mean, Gamay is, but this particular clone that is Pfeiffer's wouldn't be elsewhere.
Mm. Yeah, and that's actually one of the joys of coming from an old region, is some of these eclectic mix. So comprising the region of Rutherglen, we have 18 wineries. So we are a small wine region, but we certainly like to pack a punch on the world stage, and the quality of the wines, and the quality of Rutherglen Muscat is world renowned. Hence why we're here tonight. So and there's a number of factors you know that drives that quality. So yeah, I guess viticulturally, if we think about
We probably need to touch on climate. But we sort of briefly touched on the fact that we came as an area because rain fell at the right time in adequate quantities. The other part is that we are designated continental. We actually have a big difference between our daytime summer temperatures and our winter temperatures. There's a big difference between the two. But the other part is too, with the actual proximity to the Great Dividing Range to us, and we're in part of the Murray Valley and not too far away from the Ovens River Valley, we get a lot of moderating breezes in nighttime temperatures, which helps bring the nighttime temperatures down, which means that it gives everything a respite. The people who are working, but also the vines. And we get beautiful long autumns where the vines, the leaves are still active, which is essential and key to allow us to make those styles, which then leads us into the actual way we train them all.
Well, Rutherglen is quite a flat area, so yeah, so we're certainly in the valley, if you like, from these, accepting of all these cool breezes. So, I think Pfeiffer's probably has one of the lowest sites, which is 135 meters above sea level, and probably the highest site is not much more than 175 meters above sea level. So it's a pretty flat area, and the climate is really important to the maturation of the fruit on the vine. And those, just to give an example of those moderating temperatures, I certainly feel that we generally get about a 20-degree differential in summer and winter between nighttime and maximum daytime temperature, which is pretty critical in terms of the flavour development that happens to the fruit on the vine. Our rainfall is, I think, also pretty important. So our average annual rainfall is about 565 millimetres per year. However, I think the rainfall pattern, I certainly have observed that the rainfall pattern is changing. 30, 40 years ago, most of the rain that fell in Rutherglen would fall at the end of winter into early spring, optimal time to receive rain from a viticulture perspective. We're certainly seeing changes in our climate, and with that brings sort of more disruptive weather patterns. We're seeing more tropical influence coming down from the north of Australia, and those rain events tend to happen towards the end of spring and into summer. We still have, generally speaking, pretty dry autumns, which is really critical. However, what we do notice is that the weather patterns or the weather events are becoming more extreme. So, frosts are becoming more extreme. Bushfire events are becoming more extreme. And those vintages that are really wet are probably becoming more extreme as well.
Yeah. It is interesting to be a student of everything, and I think that's what we are. We have to be a student of the weather, of the changes, and of wine. Viticultural wise, the soil is, look, there's various ranges in the soils. We talk about red duplex over clay is one of the descriptors of it, but you can also have sandy belts as well, which is closer to the Murray River. And actually, even though we aren't we don't have a huge amount of range altitude wise, there are a few slopes, and what tends to happen is the soils on the slopes have lower clay content versus the ones on the flatter areas. And then, of course, when you get to the river, as I said, you get some sandy pockets in there, and all of these soil types have a big influence on the actual the way the vine behaves, and then of course the resultant fruit we get off the vine.
Yes, certainly my experience is that the lighter the soil, the more sand present in the soil, the sort of more elegant the muscat is, the more aromatic floral character that you have, and the more acidity. And then as the soils become heavier, the weight on the wine also becomes heavier, and you get more fullness. You tend to get a little bit more raisin-like character, and some of those sort of more concentrated raisin, Christmas pudding-like characters. Is that your experience too, Steve?
Yeah, certainly, especially when you get that higher clay content, it really makes a bigger, fuller style of wine. And the lighter soils obviously have that little bit more prettiness and a little bit more expressiveness, which is ideal for a blending position. You want to have a combination of it all. You need that depth and breadth, but you also need that aromatic profile, which aids all the way through, which is part of the process as well. In terms of canopy, look, there's probably been a bit of a change where everybody used to be what they call the Aussie sprawl, which is just basically a single fruiting wine, and you just let the vine sprawl and cover the fruit. More recently, people are starting to do a little bit more canopy training to try and expose a little bit more of the fruit. We're trying to open it up, and that's probably a function of the fact that we're getting a bit more of a change of the weather. As Jen already mentioned, that we're seeing an increase in humidity in our growing season. Muscat is so compact, and it has also a tendency for the bunches to grow on top of each other, which is prime conditions for botrytis if you get a bit of humidity. And so a lot of people are actually doing a little bit of canopy training to actually try and open it up a little bit to get a bit more airflow. Whilst there are producers who are still doing the sprawl canopy, there's just as many now who are starting to do a bit of training and trying to open it up so they can actually get a bit more airflow into the actual canopy.
Yeah, so generally speaking, everyone is hand pruning. There might be a little bit of pre-pruning that's done prior to hand pruning, but everyone's hand pruning. There's a mix of spur pruning and cane pruning. Certainly in my experience with cane pruning, you get really good spacing. So again, from a disease management point of view, that's a good thing. Bunches tend to be a little bit bigger. So that's maybe a bad thing from a disease management point of view. Crops tend to be a little bit higher with cane pruning as well. I guess the thing about cane pruning is that you're always laying down new wood. So from a sort of vine health, vine revitalization point of view, that's really good. Benefits of spur pruning tend to be a smaller bunch, smaller berry, maybe a little bit more concentration. When you do spur pruning, you get a lot of excess shoots, so sort of water shoots. So shoot thinning becomes a critical part of the management in the viticulture from that point of view. And certainly Pfeiffer's attitude is with Muscat is plenty of input in the vineyard. So we do a combination of spur and cane pruning, but we would be shoot thinning at least twice, if not 3 times. Muscat is quite vigorous. It wants to push. It wants to keep shooting, and so we're trying to control that vigor. When you're making a style of wine like this, which is incredibly concentrated, has high sugar level at the time of picking, it's not a style of wine where you can overcrop, because the vine doesn't have the capacity, won't have the capacity to ripen the fruit fully. So controlling the vigor through,
and here we're talking about vine ripening, not just ripening from the fact that the fruit has dried out on the vine. Yeah, it's actually still having the leaves out.
Yeah, so that's right. There's no cane cutting or anything like that. So yield is really, really critical. So I would think most people are targeting around that 6 to 7 tons per hectare in terms of yield with Muscat to get that to get that flavour and that concentration. Irrigation is really important as well. It's important to keep the engine of the vine going, and it's important to maintain the health of the canopy, because that's where you're going to get the ripening and the full maturation of the fruit. So we're not just talking, and Stephen and I aren't, as winemakers, we're not interested in the sweetest grapes are going to make the best wine. that's not our philosophy at all. Yes, there's a level of sugar that we need and that we strive for, but we're looking for the fruit with the most flavour, with the most genuine muscat flavour. And how you get that is maintaining the health of the vine. So irrigation is one of the key tools in that.
It's become a key tool.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's to keep the canopy fresh and active, to maintain that vibrancy of the fruit, and also to keep that factory working so that the fruit continually ripens and develops.
And also to be able to react to potential heat events
absolutely.
too. That's one of the, we're learning all the time. It was mentioned before about bushfire events. Well, the amount of information that has been gathered in terms of how to on smoke and how to treat with smoke and what to deal with smoke has gone through the roof from the first time it was flagged just 21 years ago to now. The amount of information out there is just on that is just unbelievable. And now we're seeing temperatures around 45 at times. The amount of work and the amount of advice in terms of what to do in terms of to maintain your vine health has proliferated as well. And irrigation is key to make sure you can maintain the water potential in the vine to allow it to actually close down and protect itself. You go into stress under those events, and obviously it will impact you on the way through going forward.
Sure. So I guess we have limited time, so I'm going to keep moving through. We could talk about viticulture for much longer. So if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and Lydia will definitely pipe up and let us know. But in terms of the production and the winemaking side of things prior to maturation, Steve, target Beaumay at picking or bricks?
Best, the optimum that we like to be is 18 Beaumay. We feel that gives you, because all these we ferment on skin contact to help extraction, colour, tannin, profile, extra flavour with the secondary characters as well.
And 18 Beaumay is 32 to 32 and a half bricks. If anyone needs that.
Who works on bricks. And the reason most people we like to be at that is it actually gives you adequate time to get that skin contact and extraction and a bit of fermentation but you still have life in the fruit. You don't have, the yeast is obviously under a bit of stress because it's in a very high sugar environment, but it's not as much stress as if you put it into 21, 22, which we can easily achieve. Higher is not necessarily best because you then end up with issues with the ferment. So you're better off being a little bit lower because you still have life in the fruit. So you have some freshness in the fruit, but you also have the ability to kick that ferment off and get it moving through and get all the extraction you require. If you go a little bit lower, there's always a few people who hedge a little bit lower, especially early on if we are looking like the season's a little bit up and down. 16 is the start. Nobody likes to go before 16. So 16 is the start point, but 18's the sweet spot. Once you get 22, 23, it becomes a bit of an issue. The biggest problem when you get at those higher Beaumays is that what can actually happen is you can see the ferment is going. There's all evidence that the ferment is going because you've got the CO2 being evolved, but you're not seeing any decrease in the sugar. And that's probably because there has been the raisins, the shriveled grapes, as quickly as the yeast is metabolising the sugar, more is being released as part of the fermentation and the fact you're pumping over and actually rehydrating the sugar back into the juice. It just seems to sit there. And that, of course, puts the yeast under more stress, which can then remove some of those vibrancies, aromatics, and you can end up with some other secondary characters coming through.
So when Stephen's talking about fermentation, it's important to note that we're generally speaking about a short fermentation, 2%, 3%. Generally, we're certainly not going anywhere near 50% of the sugar consumed. It's a small amount of sugar that we're consuming because that's really important in terms of the wine style, because we're wanting to leave a lot of the natural sugars in the juice for when we fortify to retain that sweetness in the wine. So the time on skins then also becomes, I guess, determined by how much fermentation you do. Certainly my choice and my philosophy is to press and then fortify. So once I've sort of hit that level of fermentation that I'm looking for, I'm immediately pressing and fortifying. So generally my muskets tend to be on skins for anywhere between 3 days. Normally it would be 3 to 5 days. And if something was particularly good or had quite a lot of sugar, then I'd go out to 7 days, but that would be quite a lot for me. So with that short contact time, what you're really looking to do is get a lot of extraction. And that's hard with muscat because we are picking at such high sugar levels. There is an element of dehydration that happens with the fruit, so it's not as juicy as normal. I tend to work on.
It's not a grape grower's variety. You don't get the return.
No. So normally you work on a ton of fruit delivering you about 750 litres per tonne of gross sort of raw wine, and with muscat it can be more in that 600 to 650 litres per tonne. So,
and when it gets really sweet, it might be more like 500 and less.
Yeah. So generally short time on skins, lots of extract. So, lots of pumping over, lots of plunging, lots of foot treading, whatever the method is. There's plenty of different vessels. We've got open vats, potters, closed fermenters, rotary fermenters. That's right. So, and your fermentation vessel all contributes to the house style. So I guess in terms of fortification, what we're fortifying with, Stephen, is?
We're neutral grape spirit. Most people now, it used to be in the past SVR, so Spirit Vinous Rectifus. And you want neutral. So you don't want really any aromatic, but you also don't want heat when you taste it, because if it's hot and you put it into the wine, it'll make the wine hot. So it needs to actually have a smooth, cleansing finish. A lot of people nowadays, we getting to the point we're using triple distilled, column distilled alcohol. And the obvious question that generally comes up in this is, do you do it yourself? No, we don't distill. Most people buy in. Our reason behind why we don't distill is we never had a still. But the other reason is that distilling is a fractionation process. And we only want the heart. We only want the neutral stuff in the middle. You've got the stuff either side, which is okay if you're making your tawny styles and VP styles for other styles of fortified wines. But even then, you don't necessarily want the tails. And so what do you do with that? And so we leave that to somebody else to deal with, and we just buy in the finished product.
Oh, good on you, Steve. That's very honest, reason. So the strength of the spirit tends to be around that 96%. So it's really, really high strength, very, very neutral. And as Steve said, the quality of the spirit is critical. We're not looking for a huge contribution from the spirit with muscat, because muscat's got so much flavour in the fruit that we're looking for the fruit to do the talking.
I see it as a preservative. I see it as the aid to stop the fermentation and preserve the aromatic and the flavour.
Yep.
And not to contribute, not the complexing factor as you see in other styles.
Yep.
Could I just jump in here with a couple of questions?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but before you sort of move on too far. So we had a question about fermentation and yeast selection. So is there any particular strains or things of yeast that you use?
This is
different philosophies.
Our secret.
I'm not going to change what I'm doing. I don't add yeast. So I did earlier in my career, and I had mixed results with aldehyde production. So I tend to just if there's wild yeast that wants to take off, I let it take off. And then if the yeast doesn't take off, and I get no fermentation, then I just do my, do a process of extraction. And when I think I've got enough extract out of the fruit, then I'll press and fortify. So, and I've found by doing that, generally when the wines do decide to ferment and when they're fermenting, I have much cleaner ferments, because the yeast are obviously happy in that environment.
So as Jen led off with, I'm looking back a few more generations. So I was told you cross seed. So my father used to just have a red ferment next door and would just put some of the red ferment on the first muscat that came in, and then you just keep using. You don't use that same ferment, then you just use that muscat to go on subsequently. I don't do that entirely now. I do actually do a yeast preparation on the first muscat that comes in, and I tend to pick a little bit lower to make sure it goes. And I'm actually using, I have been using some non-Saccharomyces yeasts. So it's a little bit like doing the wild ferment that Jen is doing, because a lot of wild ferments start with non-Saccharomyces yeast. So for those who are unaware, Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the workhorse and generally finishes off 90% of ferments. So even if they start wild and have a whole population of other yeasts in there, over time, cerevisiae is the one which becomes the dominant and finishes the ferment off. So with my buying a commercial prepared one, I'm sort of trying to synthesize that with not using the Saccharomyces. I know it's a very short ferment, but I do cross seeding.
Yeah. There you go. I learned something there. Great question.
Yeah, thank you. And I love the different approaches. And then just going back to what you were doing in the vineyard, there was a question about, could you also explain how all these techniques in the vineyard management impact the aroma characteristics and style of Rutherglen Muscat?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So I think, so number one, if I would be very concerned if I did nothing, if I just pruned grapes and then just walked away and said, let's just come back and see when they're ready and pick them. I'd be very concerned that I would, number one, I'd be carrying too much fruit. And so if I've got too big a yield, I'm not going to get the concentration. I'm not going to get the sugar level I'm looking for, but I'm also not going to get that concentration of flavour and the intensity of flavour, which Rutherglen Muscat's so known for. So controlling the vigour, controlling the yield, really important from a flavour point of view. Also from a disease management point of view, it's super critical as well. So again, from a flavour point of view, how that would translate into the wine. Well, if we have disease, then you're carrying those potentially rotten fruit flavors through to the finished product, so you can get a musty, moldy character, which does not age well.
And it affects you when you're trying to do your ferment in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's true as well. One of the things, I guess in a more sort of normal year when doing trials, I tend to find in really hot, dry years, our cane pruned fruit performs better, and then in wetter years or cooler years, our spur pruned fruit performs better. So it seems to have more concentration, more depth. It's the high, tends to be the higher quality. So that's just sort of an observation that I've seen.
We only spur prune anyway. Sorry, not spur prune. We only cane prune. So we don't see that variation that Jen can see. But you can manipulate your vigour by actually shortening your canes, which is, the one thing we see with one of the reasons why we do cane pruning is that we see that you treat every vine as an individual. If you go mechanically and just potentially go spur, sometimes it can be more of a vineyard approach. If people don't, in both cases, if people don't know what they're doing, you can end up with a mess.
Mm.
And that's probably the other issue that we're all dealing with, is trying to get the skilled workers who actually know what they're doing when it comes to pruning vines.
Yeah,
because it is an art.
The other thing I'd say with all of this sort of manipulation of the canopy and manipulation of the crop, in a very hot, dry year, you can risk overexposing the fruit, and then sunburn can become an issue. And when you get sunburn in Muscat, you get an acceleration of that raisoning. But it's when it's accelerated, it becomes bitter. And you actually lose the sweetness. You're sort of just getting a bit of hardness, sort of phenolic character coming through. So it's a fine art, and you sort of have to, like, I use a lot of gut instinct in terms of how hard we're going to shoot thin, how much exposure we're going to do, and sometimes you have to be a little bit reactive to the weather that's put in front of you. But if like this year, my gut feeling is that we're looking for it's going to be warm, it's going to be dry. It's going to be an early season, and so I'm actually, leaving a little bit more canopy, leaving a little bit more shade, leaving a bit more protection. Last year, we had sort of weather, bad weather at this time of year, lots of rain, and I went for a lot more exposure than what I'm doing this year. So that's sort of experience and gut feel that drives those decisions.
Brilliant,
Yeah.
thank you. And just going forward, one more question about winemaking, and then I'll let you move on to maturation. So, do either of you use any enzymes during the fermentation?
Yep.
No.
Keep the questions coming. You can see this happening all night. So I do. I add enzyme at the crusher. So it's just a sort of bit of a general enzyme that's meant to help with the extraction and also with a little bit of settling down the track. For my mind, Muscats are highly pectolytic variety, meaning it has a lot of pectin in it. Therefore, that translates into a lot of solids. So anything that can help me compact those solids down and get more clear is pretty beneficial in my mind.
I mean, I say no, but it doesn't mean that I won't consider doing in the future an addition of one of the enzymes, which is meant to help filterability, because it is a difficult variety to filter. All fortifieds are difficult to filter because of the sugar and alcohol matrix, and so anything that will aid in that is probably something that would be worthwhile to investigate.
Do it.
Maybe.
Any more questions, Lydia, or do you want us to keep rolling?
No, that's it for now. So please, crack on.
Okay, so so I guess one of the other real key ingredients in the production of these wines is the maturation. So we talk about terroir from a viticulture perspective, but when it comes to fortified wines that are matured in wood, I think it's a good way to think about it is terroir of the cellar. Because everyone's cellar and what your cellar comprises of is obviously your building structure, which contributes to the temperature within the cellar, which contributes to the humidity within the cellar, and your matrix of barrels, older oak versus younger oak, format in terms of large wood versus small wood. All of those things contribute to the maturation process. So when the wine's maturing, Steve, there's quite a lot of chemical changes that's happening. Do you want to talk about that, with the oxygen and the evaporation and all of that?
I didn't really want to, but I think we just maybe step back a bit. I suppose within 1 year, we're not making one batch of mustard. We're making multiple batches.
Yeah.
And within those multiple batches, there'll be various levels of quality.
Yep.
And so when you go forward, you are trying to keep everything separate as much as you can, or you put like with like, so you can actually let them mature out and you can actually gauge them as they go through. You don't just go, well, there's my Muscat, we'll just put it in one big tank and then I'll just put it in, 200 casks at the end of it. We actually segment it out as we go along, as we're bringing them into the winery. You have a fair idea when it's out in the vineyard, but you also have a fair idea when it first comes into the winery, the aromatics of it and how it ferments, about where you think it's going to sit. And then we'll do a tasting as well. Obviously, we then, what people will do after that in terms of how their clarification and how clear they go into the cask can vary a little bit. But we all try and put them into older casks, older vessels. So we're looking just at the oxidative and the interaction with the greater environment. We're not looking at oak impact. We are, yes, quite a few of us, even us, we are conditioning new barrels all the time. We're bringing barrels out of table wines, be it 225 barriques, or if we can get our hands on those bigger ones, we will get our hands on the bigger ones because our style is actually large format oak. And when we talk about barrel sizes, they can be anywhere from 125 litres all the way up to 5,500. So there's quite a range that people use. And how they age and how quickly they age is related to those sizes. So the bigger the size, the slower the aging, and therefore they stay a little bit fresher. You don't get as much concentration, but you retain that freshness of fruit. You put it in a smaller vessel, obviously you get a lot more concentration of evaporation, so you get a lot more increase in the viscosity, you get a lot more mouthfeel, and it looks a lot older than what it actually is in a shorter period of time.
So on that, Stephen, my sort of philosophy is if I have something that I want to keep for a long time, so if I've got something that I've classified into the, say, rare classification where I'm thinking it's going to age in barrel for 20 plus years, I will try and allocate that wine into a larger format barrel, to slow down that maturation so that when it is the 20 years old, it's hanging on to its freshness beautifully. And then I would be looking for things that I'm trying to use more quickly, say in the Rutherglen or the classic classification, they'll tend to go into a smaller format oak. Is that your philosophy, or you have a different approach to your allocation of cask size?
Well, it's a combination. So generally so if your cask had one of your rare wines in it, you generally try and put a wine of similar ilk into it next time. Because you get obviously a little bit of carryover from the previous wine. And so it's a good idea to keep a track of where you've been putting your better wines and try and keep those casks aside for the better wines as well. If you don't do that, you potentially degrade or increase. Yes, you can increase as well, but you won't get as much pushback from a poorer quality wine going in a good cask than if you put a good wine in a poorer cask. And it could be poorer for another reason. It might not be because of the wine that was in there beforehand. It might have some issues with leakages or something like that. So, my philosophy is a little bit like Jen's. Yes, you try and keep them aside. I do actually move them around a little bit to try and keep the cask a bit fuller. So we'll go back through and taste them at different times and try and put like with like to actually keep them full to try and help that freshness as well. So, because if you start getting too much headspace, obviously it oxidizes out quicker.
Yeah, so throughout the maturation process, there's quite a few chemical changes that's happening. So there's a micro-oxidation that's happening continuously because, of course, the wood is porous, so oxygen can slowly enter the barrel and come in contact with the wine. And likewise, there's an evaporation or evaporative loss that occurs over the period of time, which we colloquially call the angel's share. So while that generally the component that is evaporating through this aging period is water, but a little bit of alcohol also will evaporate off. So we estimate we lose roughly 3% of our volume per year through evaporation. So to put that into context, if you were to just have a barrel and do nothing for 20 years, the wine with 3% evaporation, you will have half the volume in that barrel in 20 years. So it is really significant. Now, if the water content of the wine's evaporating off, then what's happening to the other componentry of the wine, Steve?
Well, it's concentrating up. So yeah, and this is where it's important to know your wine and to assess it all the time in an even way, because what tends to happen is obviously with this concentration, which means you're getting an increase in sugar, not so much in the alcohol, because as Jen says, some of the alcohol can be stolen. I like to think that it's conveyor going to the barossa, because they talk about alcohol creep over there. So we send our alcohol back to them, and we sort of say, sort of stay sort of round about where we start.
That's true.
You know, but so you're getting concentration of the sugar, concentration of the flavour, but you're also getting an increase in the acid, so your pH is dropping. And so that's to keep, and you're hoping that you've done the right choice, and that's keeping that sugar in balance to balance out that increase in sugar. You're getting that pH change as well. So
yeah, your glycerol goes up, which adds to that sense of lusciousness. But your tannin extract is also going up through the concentration process as well. So everything's going up. So yes, the sugar, often people think about the sugar going up, but you've got to think about all those other things that is balancing the wine. And how we balance these wines with such high sugar is, there's a number of methods. So you've got acid as one function. You've got tannin through grape tannin, but also wood tannin. You've got the extract that's coming through, and you've got alcohol to a point as well. And of course, the other thing that really balances the sugar is the flavour, actual fruit flavour. If you've got fruit flavour to carry that sugar, then you get that great length and persistence. If you don't have the fruit flavour, you're more likely to see the wine as being cloying.
And that's realistically the sum total of when we're looking at these wines first off, is we're looking for palate length and structure. Yeah. And if it's not there in the young wine, it won't necessarily magically appear in an older wine. If anything, that deficiency that was missing as a younger wine will be more amplified as you age them up. And that's why, we tend to, if we feel that wine is good, but it's not as best as we can make, that's the wine which we'll use in the things like the classic and Rutherglen. So you get that joy of the fruit vibrancy and coming through, but you need to have that balance and structure and that power to go with the older wines.
Yeah, so one of the things to me that's really important through the barrel maturation period is maintaining the wine quality. So it's certainly not a set and forget process. It's not filling the barrel, walking away and coming back in 20 years and just that magically it's amazing. There's a lot of work that happens over the period of time. So sulfur is really important to the maintenance of these wines. It provides that stability, microbial stability to the wines, which is really important for such a long period of time in barrels. So we're looking to top our sulfur once or twice per year. Like Stephen said, we do a lot of reworking. So we're doing rack and returns, cleaning barrels in between, sometimes filtering wine before it goes back into barrel, blending, as Stephen said, like with like, trying to keep our barrels relatively full, not in the same way as table wine, but relatively a program where they're being maintained in a relatively full way, which I think is important for your wine quality as well as the freshness of the wine.
I suppose there is another part. So as you said, Jen, before, to me, you've got what's happening in the winery going on. The biggest thing you have to be careful of is when you work with your wines. Most of us don't have any heating or cooling in our winery, in our maturation areas. So the wines can drop or increase considerably over the course of the year, temperature-wise. And so when you're reworking your wines, you have to bear in mind that if you're working with them in the middle of winter, give yourself a little bit more room. So when you get to summer, you don't all of a sudden have to do more rework because you've overfilled them in winter.
That's true. That's true.
Could I jump in with a couple of questions? So, one about the barrels. Where do you source them from? Is the old oak from around the world, or is it just sort of previous Rutherglen or other Aussie fortified wines?
So being a 40-year-old producer, we've had to source a lot of wood. So we've picked up ex-fortified barrels from other producers, mainly in Australia. We have a few ex-whiskey barrels, which appear to be Scottish. How they got here, I'm not sure. We've got a few port branded barrels as well, and a couple of Australian distilleries, like old Australian distilleries that are no longer in business. But a lot of what Pfeiffer's has had to do is condition the wood ourselves. So my dad, had to convert lots of ex-red wine, table wine barrels into fortified barrels. So firstly, putting port in as the first fill, or tawny bases as the first fill after red, and then converting a tawny barrel into a muscat, and then a muscat into a topache. And that's been a real challenge for us as a relatively young producer, not to have the library of oak at our fingertips that a more established, 150-year-old producer has.
I suppose we probably better explain what conditioning is. So when you buy your barrel for your table wine production, it'll impart some oak tannins and flavour to the wine, and you'll get 3 or 4 uses out of it. But just because it's no longer putting anything in the table wine, when you bring them across to the fortifieds, that increase in alcohol from that 14 to 18% is enough to drag out a little bit more. And so it's almost like you're starting with a new barrel again. And so this conditioning is actually trying to remove those oak lactones, the flavours out of the barrel, so it's only just a neutral barrel again. And so this is why that Jen's saying that, you put tawnies in there, or for us, I tend to just put lower quality muscats in there, which I know that I'm potentially going to blend away. And I'd take that into consideration. Because I've got older, bigger formats, I can sneak it into other things and not have it show out. But you've got to that's what the conditioning process is just removing that last little bit more of the oak character out of the barrel before it becomes a fully fortified wine. We do actually have ex-sherry, ex-whiskey. If we go through the place, obviously when the wine industry was starting up, everything was being shipped back and forth in barrels, and so things would have come out here in barrel, and they would have been grabbed by the young wine industry for whatever they could grab to put their wines in, and so we've got them through our winery as well.
Brilliant, thank you. One other question about winemaking. So you commented on some of the impact of climate change in the vineyard, but has it had any effect in the way that you're making Rutherglen Muscat in terms of winemaking adjustments or altering the kind of final style of the wine?
Yeah, well, I guess this is the great thing about making this kind of multi-generational style of wine. We have we have our father or our parents and grandparents that we can talk to about what they did, and certainly one of the things that I've discussed with my dad Chris, who has established Pfeiffers and is a winemaker as well, is one of the things we see. There's absolutely no problems achieving Beaumay now. So 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, I'll say, when he was at the beginning of his career, you didn't always achieve 16 Beaumay, which we just now take as minimum standard. So the wines were drier probably 40 to 50 years ago. And one of the things I've noticed is that, because we can achieve sugar so easily, the wines are probably a little bit sweeter than what they were. And that, I think, is something that we really have to consider as winemakers moving forward, that we don't just continually push for more and more and more sweetness, that we focus on the flavour. But Steve, I think, is a really great person to talk to this question, because he really carries the I don't want to say weight, that's not the right word, but he really carries the Chambers style, and he's really, a guardian and a protector of that style, and has great respect for what's come before. So he's doing a lot of things to try and maintain it as it was.
Oh, thanks, Jen. Yeah, it's actually interesting. So I suppose we're without touching on it, we're getting a bit of decoupling flavour from sugar, and that's the other part that's going on, which makes it a bit trickier. So I've noted over the course of just by having a look at just the figures and comparing them to other wineries in the district, that our wines they've always seemed drier on the finish, and that's probably a little bit of the winery site detail, but it's also the what we get from our vineyard and what we're doing in the winery. I tend to actually do what is colloquially termed more ferment style. So I actually will ferment longer with a goal to get to a Beaumont figure after fortification, which is very different to what quite a few of the other producers are doing, who are saying, well, if I'm 20, I'm going to do my 2% fermentation. If I'm 18, I'm going to do my 2% fermentation. And so they get a range of wines with different varying levels of sweetness. I will get that too, but I'm still trying to go a little bit lower. And in fact, this year I had to do I had to do two things that I normally don't do. So normally when we bring the fruit in, you have a tendency to try and reintroduce the dried fruit, which gets spat out the end of your destemmer, back into the ferment. I stopped doing that partway through this vintage because we were getting such high sugars, it wasn't needed. It wasn't necessary, so I stopped doing that. The second thing I had to do was, because I was so damn ripe, I also had to press off a hell of a lot earlier than what I would have preferred to, because, as I alluded to before, that we were finding that, yes, the ferment was going, but there was no drop in sugar. And so it's right, let's remove the sugar source, which is the grapes. So I pressed and did some fermentation away from the grape skins itself. And I've just literally finished working with the last one of them. It does take a fair bit of time for us to clean up after vintage. I don't know whether you're finished, are you yet, Jen?
I've still got a couple of parcels to filter.
Yeah, so she's still going through vintage. I've just finished. And we're in what is December. It basically, it ended up at about 12 Beaumont on a final figure, which is, on where I like to be, but it was 19% alcohol. It showed how much it had fermented. I only went to fortify that to 16. So it tells me there was an extra 3% of alcohol in that wine because I couldn't see it. So I'm looking at in the past, and I'm looking at my rares and saying, well, they're not as sweet. I'm not keen on putting really sweet wines in there. I'm not going to change that style. I'm quite happy to sit there on the end and being the dry bugger at the end of the table.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, do you have any more questions, Lydia? Or keep going.
No, I would say if you want to move on to blending and classifications, and then I can do any others at the end.
Yeah, I think the classifications is probably the thing to talk about now. Blending sort of feeds into it. So we'll flip to the slide of the classification system. So the classification system was introduced and developed in 1995 by the Muscat of Rutherglen Network, which was a group of Muscat producers all coming together, wanting to promote Muscat and take Muscat, to the world. And prior to 1995, there'd been no sort of real way to distinguish the different quality levels in the wines within the region. So you could come to our region and you could get a reserve muscat from one producer for $10 a bottle, for example, and a reserve muscat from another producer at $100 a bottle. And for the consumer, that was really confusing. So, the Muscat of Rutherglen Network all got together and came up with and developed the classification system, which comprises of 4 tiers. We have the Rutherglen classification, which is the foundation style. It's the youngest. It's generally speaking 3 to 5 years average age in barrel. Whenever we talk about average age, we're always talking about time in barrel for any of the classifications. These wines have beautiful expressions of fruit. They're the most pure fruited, wonderful aromatics. You're not seeing a huge level of age coming through, a little bit of age character, but not a huge level of age coming through. They should be bright and fresh and very primary, with the typical Muscat flavors with the florals, the rose petals, the raisins, the Christmas pudding, those type of things. We shouldn't see too much influence from the spirit. So there should have been enough time in barrel for that spirit to have integrated and make a beautiful, luscious, fresh, very, very easy drinking style. Then we move on to the classic. Now these wines tend to have an average age of around that 10 to 12 years in barrel. And while these wines are still primary in that they have all of those incredible fruit flavors I just spoke about, things are just taken up a notch within the classic classification. There's greater levels of concentration, there's greater depth, there's greater complexity. There's more of those nutty characters coming through with all those primary fruit characters. There's a deepening of the colour. There's, you know, more glycerol, more lusciousness, more power. And then we move on to the grand. Now there's always a big jump between classic and grand. Once these wines get to be about 15 years old, you really sort of see a big change into the secondary characters from the primary characters. And on the picture on that slide, you can see the bottles at the glasses at the front with the dark colours is more what we would see in the grand and the rare, and then the ones with the lighter colours of the Rutherglens and the classic. So they're always
that's the example of the oxidative nature of it. The wines darken as they oxidise.
Absolutely. So yeah, so the grands, you know, those wines are 15 to 18 years average age in barrel. Some are even a little bit older than that. And these are incredible wines. The colours have gone from showing those reds, red tawny like colours into the browns and the blacks with the olive green hue. So you're really seeing that wood age development coming through. Immense levels of power and concentration. Beautiful nuttiness coming through, and while you still carry that muscat flavour, because the purity of muscat fruit is incredible and carries through all the classifications, you're seeing things like coffee and dark chocolate and chicory, even sometimes some malt, roasted nuts coming into your grands, and everything is just amping up more and more and more. And then of course there's the rare, which is the pinnacle of the style. So 20 years average age, if not more. I mean, a lot of people's rares are over 30 years old in barrel. This is the epitome of the style for all of our producers. This is what represents, the very best wines made from the very best vintages, matured in the very best casks and blended to that beautiful, beautiful wine, which has the ultimate levels of fruit and power, lusciousness, complexity, drive, and length that just goes on and on and on. Incredible wines. But how we get to all of these is through blending, Stephen.
I knew I was going to have to do something. Yeah, so the key with all of these is obviously we're stepping up in age and depth and complexity, but the other part of this is to retain brightness and freshness. So when we say freshness, they've still got to have liveliness to the wine. There's one thing to have age for age's sake, but they tend to be a little bit flat, right? So the aromatic, the noses tend to be a little bit dull, the palate tends to be a little bit broad, and they just don't finish off with a cleansing finish. So the blending comes in to the fore. There is about choosing the right parcels and actually taking the time to actually get the individual components together to hit the spots you're trying to look for. So, for example, with the classic, with that bright freshness, but with that hint of age, and that's where the skill comes in, and being able to identify what actually will give the actual piece. So you can be sitting there on the bench, and you can have half a dozen wines in front of you, and you can put it together, and you go, "That's not quite right. I'm missing something." And the blending skill is to say, "I think that wine over there, take one out and put a different one in, is what I need to do." And that partly comes from experience, but partly comes from the actual skill of the blender, being able to identify in the individual components of the wines that they're dealing with what they actually need to alter to get their final wine. And these non-vintage, because we are constantly working with them, and we're constantly bottling, and in the ideal world, you bottle these wines on demand, because what happens is the place they mature and they stay the freshest is in the cask. Once you stick them in the bottle. We're basically saying we've done all the work for you. They are the best they're going to be, right? Don't stick them on your shelf and in a dusty corner and come back to them in 20 years' time. That's not the nature of those wines. The nature of those wines is to actually drink them when they're fresh. So in an ideal world, you should be. We like to bottle them as we require to help maintain that freshness. So regardless of whether they're being sold through the cellar door or they're on the other side of the world, they actually have been bottled relatively short period of time before they hit the markets to retain that freshness. So that's the other part of it too. But the blending is being able to identify what is required. Now, in this blending, there is some various different ways to do it as well. Some people will do a straight bench blend where they actually pull their samples out of the cask and assemble them on the bench before in front of themselves, and will mix and match until they get the final point. Others will run through a modified Solera system or a Solera system where they're actually doing it by halves, and they are actually identifying the wine to enter, and they progress that wine through the system, and they have the wine, they have the barrel that bottle from. So they both have their merits. Sometimes even in the Solera system, you have to pull them apart and put them back together again because they might not be quite right. And that's what you've got to be aware and willing to do too, is to be willing to go back and say, oh, I think we can do better with this, and having the time to work with it and change it.
Yes, we certainly never let a blend die, if that makes sense. So all of these, I call them the commercial blends, so to speak. So the classifications, the Rutherglen Classic, Brand and Rare, we always blend up more than we think that we are required to sell. And then, throughout the year, as we draw down on that sales stock, when I get to around that 50% of volume that I've used, that's when I look to reblend, and then I'm blending back into the existing blend with new batches. And I do that on the bench, kind of like Stephen said, but that original blend has not died, and that's a way to, that I think you get consistency. Consistency is super important in what we're doing here. It's a consistency of style, it's a consistency of classification, and obviously a consistency of quality.
Yeah, to maintain that consistency, you have to leave some of the previous blend. If you start from scratch every single time, it is nigh on impossible to replicate or get near where you started. And so you'll have too much variation, and that's not what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to achieve, as Jen said, the consistency, and by rolling some of it over, you're actually being able to help achieve that consistency. Sometimes you run them down a little bit further if you feel that you need to do a bit of a major reworking, or you might leave some of it aside for the next time. So you sometimes you have to be willing to say, oh, maybe if I don't use all of it, I use part of it, but you still use some of the previous blends. So.
Yeah, it's certainly a critical skill, and one again that you learn, and it's one of the great beauties of what we do with the cross-generational winemaking and working with your parents or the generation before you, is learning some tricks of the trade. I certainly know when I first came home, and I'm a little bit competitive as a person, and I used to say to my dad, you make a blend and I'll make a blend and we'll see whose is better. Now, for a long time, he was absolutely winning hands down, and then all of a sudden, I started learning the tricks, and I'm doing okay now.
Lovely to hear. Could I just ask one question about, because probably tied into blending and consistency, is about the fortification level, because usually your Rutherglen Muscats are about 18%. So how do you handle that with the evaporation? You mentioned 3% evaporation per year. How do you kind of maintain the ABV level?
So as part of that evaporative loss, what we see is that there's not only is the water evaporating, but we're also getting a little bit of alcohol evaporating off. So actually, in my experience, the alcohol stays relatively stable. If anything, actually, the alcohol would drop in my winery rather than go up. So we're fortifying to 17.5 to 18 is our ideal to go to wood, and then when I do a blend, I will always check do a full analysis, and if I need to top up the alcohol, I would top it up, sort of, at the time of blending.
The other little way to do it is you alter from year to year, so you don't always go to 17.5, for example. You might do a couple of years you fortify to 18. So when you blend those years, you can balance them back against the 17.5s or something which is a little bit lower. So there are other little ways to get around worrying about if you lose too much. You can go up and down a little bit on the alcohol. For a while there, and this is not on Muscat, this is actually on the other variety that we make in the district opaque. For a while there, my father was a very, very good winemaker, but he was also a very, very good procrastinator. And he wasn't great at checking his alcohols all the time after he did his initial fortification. And we ran into trouble with our opaques for a while there where the alcohols were too low. And so we went through a program for a number of years of actually fortifying to 19. So when we blended these lower alcohol wines back, we ended up at that 17.5, 18. Now we don't have to do that anymore, but that was a way to, instead of having to go back and try and look at every single, and we went and checked every cask's alcohol. Now we have 165 casks and probably just as many small wood. And we're doing a bulliometry, which is a lot of water boiling and wine boiling. It takes a long time and actually doing your alcohol that way. And this is one of the interesting things is, so you all know your alcohol tolerances on labels, For whatever reason, some smarty said that fortifieds, which are harder to check alcohols on, require a smaller tolerance. But it's very hard to actually get your alcohols right. So that's one of our little tricks that we do in our wineries. I'll go up and down a little bit on my fortifying just to hedge out. When you mess it up, you end up at 19. When you come at the end, it's a bit hard. That's where you know, whoops, I messed up. So you still get up the other way, but that is another little trick.
I think I always there's always something I learn when Stephen and I present together about what he's doing that's different to me, and I hope that actually has come through this evening or this morning. There's it's a really complex wine to make. There's so many factors that go into it, and when you think about you're making wines that have a maturation time, can have a maturation time of over 20 years. All of those little differences that you make along the way, or decisions you make along the way, cane pruning versus spur pruning, sandy soil versus, more clay-based soils, fermenting on skins for 7 days to a certain Beaumet versus fermenting on skins for 3 days with not much regard for what that Beaumet is. Over that period of time of those 20 years, those little decisions that you make take greater effect and become more obvious. And those things really influence the house style. Now, if you were here tonight with Stephen and I in this luxurious position that we're in Rutherglen, where we have all of the classifications of on the bench here, the Pfeiffers and the Chambers wines, you would be able to see those differences and we could speak to that. But I think that's one of the really amazing things, the really interesting things, that the deeper you dive into Rutherglen Muscat, the more you understand about these house styles, the more you understand about the factors that go into these house styles. And that's something, that we've sort of talked about in terms of the production of these wines today, the effect on those house styles. And when you see them all lined up, every house is distinctly different, and it's a product of history of that house, the knowledge that's been passed down from generation, the site, the viticulture philosophy, the winemaking philosophy, the maturation vessels and the maturation facility that people have, the maturation technique. Again, these are skills that are passed down from generation to generation. You don't learn this at uni. And in the end, these wines become the house style. And they speak not only of the place, but they speak very much of the place, but they speak of the people and the families that have made them. And I think that's what makes them so special.
Yeah. So so following on for that, so when you have a look at the four wines that we actually have in front of us here, from your left to right is the Rutherglen Classic Grand Rare. Another way to look at it is the first two, which is the Rutherglen and the Classic, especially the Rutherglen, is an expression of the site, the expression of the vineyard, and to some degree the individual winemakers' influence. But that's vineyard site, that's expression there. When you look at the other two, you're now starting to get the site of the winery maturation site coming in. So if we took wines out of each of our wineries and swapped them over, because of the site, they will mature over time. They'll be very different.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I hope I hope that that's an inspiration for you guys to move forward and drink more Muscat of Rutherglen, promote more Muscat of Rutherglen, and delve deeper into Muscat of Rutherglen.
Thank you both so much. I think that's a wonderful point to close on there, that you have all these sort of myriad of decisions from everything in the vineyard through to the final bottling. And I'm sure everyone's just jealous that they can't be tasting the the range in front of them like you two can come in shortly. But I think we will wrap that up there. It's been extremely informative. I've learned a lot. So thank you so much both for sharing your insights. I think we could go for another 2 hours. There's so much to talk about, but thank you so much for all that in-depth discussion. I'm sure all the students will find that incredibly useful.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Lydia, and thank you to WSET for hosting, and thank you for everyone for your attendance. Hopefully, you've really enjoyed it, and you will all be champions of Rutherglen Muscat moving forward.
And if anybody has any additional questions going forward, don't hesitate to try and reach out. We'll be happy to help on that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both, Jen and Stephen, so much. Have a wonderful evening. Enjoy those Rutherglen Muscats, and I hope you do get a couple of days off over Christmas.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Goodbye.